and welcome. Today we are going to be doing the first step in the Color Me Happy handbag, and this is going to be specifically if you're going to do the pieced exterior of the main body part, and this is what you're going to end up with by the time we're done. It's going to be super simple and you're going to love it, I'm sure of it. And I'm just going to step you through the whole thing, so let's get at it. We're going to get started with the pieced exterior. So if you're going to use several different fabrics, this is a great stash buster, by the way, if you want to use a whole bunch of different pieces all the way along. So what I've done is I've given just a really basic kind of, if you want to use 4 different colors, that there's the different colors actually on this little chart. You can also just choose your own, figure out, color it, do whatever you want with it. It's Color Me Happy, so whatever makes you happy, that's what you should use. So this is what we're going to get started on, and I'm going to explain how to piece all of this together. So the first thing that we're going to do, I have everything cut out. So I have my fabric is interfaced. I use SF101, or actually a product similar to it. I use Presto. Now, you'll notice on your pattern piece there's little numbers on some of the edges. Now this one does not have, I'll just take that off. This one doesn't have a number on that because that is actually the top edge. What these little numbers signify is the order in which you're going to sew the pieces together. Now, to get started with that, I want to make sure that I have on the back of my pattern pieces, I want all my numbers on there. So I'm going to just go through each pattern piece and I'm just going to write the number on that edge. So I want to make sure though that that when I flip this over, this is number 1 and this is number 2 and this happens to be number 10. So I'm just going to go back. I'm just going to put it quite lightly, and I'm just going to write it kind of in my seam allowance. You won't see it anyway, and this was number 10. So I'm ready. I'm just going to leave them together for now. It's a little easier to see when I'm grabbing my pattern pieces. And I'm going to go through each one and put all of the numbers that I need on there. So I'm going to just simply go in order. So I'm looking for my number 1s. So this is number 1 here, this is number 1 here. I'll just take my pattern pieces off. And because I've got them written on the back as well, I know that I need to match those up. It's going to be very natural. There's going to be little spots where there's little triangles that are sticking out. Just center your seam the best you can. And I'm just going to clip this together, and now I'm simply going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to stop right here and just kind of emphasize the importance of keeping a very consistent seam allowance and being as close to a 1/4 inch as you possibly can. Now quilters are a little more used to this. They understand that when you're piecing a quilt, when you consider the amount of seams, if you're only out just a tiny bit on each seam, it's going to make a big difference overall. Just on this piece that we're going to be putting together, I'll use an example of if we were out an 1/8 of an inch, which doesn't seem like very much. If we were out an 1/8 of an inch on every seam that on this piece that we're putting together, that would make an 1.25 inch difference because there's 10 seams when you're putting everything together. So if we if we did a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance instead of a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, we would end up 1 1/4 inches short of where we're supposed to be. So we want to be really, really careful when we do the seam that we keep that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to sew this. I'm going to open it up, but I'm going to press to one side and then I'm going to top stitch on that side. With seam allowances and also with top stitching, consistency is the key. When I'm sewing my seam, I use 2.5 as my stitch length. When I'm top stitching, I use 4 as my stitch length. So we want to keep a consistent seam allowance of 1/4 of an inch. Also then, when we go to top stitch, we want to keep, it doesn't matter what it is, I prefer 1/8 of an inch away from my seam, and I like to stay very consistent. I have a spot on my foot, on my presser foot, on my 2010, I'm using Juki 2010s, that it's about halfway between the one side of the foot, and that's what I use as my guide. So I'm not watching where my needle is, I'm actually watching where my seam is. So I keep that seam at about halfway through that foot. So that seems to give me my consistent 1/8 of an inch. No matter what you choose, whether it's a little bit wider or a little bit narrower, as long as you're consistent, your top stitching will look better. So we've got number 1 is done. So now we need number 2. So that happens to be A2 as well. So I've got my number 2 here. Flip that over, I've got number 2 there. So once again, find it a little bit easier if I go on this side, so I can see where my little triangles are. 1/4 inch seam allowance, 2.5 stitch length, gonna press it to one side. I try to consistently also press always to the same side, and we'll see that as I go along here. But I'm going to do this one and then top stitch. So once again, I've got this seam done, top stitched, and I'm just going to, trim my little triangles off here, but I'm going to resist the urge to square everything up. If you're a quilter, that's where you'll understand about always keeping things squared up. I'm just ever so slightly out here. It's not a big deal. I'm just going to continue on. Okay, so now number 3 is here and number 3 is here. I'm not going to be walking through every single seam, but my next one is going to be number 4. So this one is number 4 on here, and it's number 4 on here. So I'm going to lay this down, and I'm going to lay this on top. And you'll see that I've got really quite long triangles. Again, don't be too concerned with that. I'm also just a tiny bit short here. There's just a little bit. It's very difficult because we've got a lot of the grain going, we got kind of biased the way that the grain of the fabric and the interfacing is going, so we will have a little bit of distortion. We're just going to try and minimize that as much as we can, but here I just want to kind of center this and get this seam done. So I've done number 4, which was this seam right here. Now I'm on to number 5. So now I actually have to use, these two are marked number 5 and this one is marked number 5. Now this was from the original one that we started with. So now again, just following, it's just like putting together a puzzle. On this one, again, I've got a little bit of a little notch here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to match up the edge here and match up the edge on this end and just let that lay where it is. I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's not going to affect that. I'm just going to go ahead and sew like I normally would. And I'm just going to continue on. I'm just going to repeat the process. Number 5, go number 6, number 7, and eventually we'll just have one long piece. Now I can't zoom out quite far enough that I can get both ends at the same time in my camera shot here. But when we're all done, we've got one long piece. Now these are not squared because there's just a slight angle, and that is supposed to be that way. Now once you have all of this together, I want you to measure from this top corner to this corner. When it's all stretched out, it should be 34.5. Then this one as well should be 34.5. Hopefully you're somewhere close in there. If you're too long, trim, but make sure that you trim it exactly the same amount so that this edge stays straight to this edge. I'm not sure if that's going to make sense, but anyway, so if you were, say you were a 1/2 inch too wide for whatever reason, make sure that when you lay your ruler on here to cut this off, that you're 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch so that this stays consistent again. Okay, so if you're too short, hopefully you won't be too short, and this last seam allowance is still going to be 1/4 inch. But if you need to adjust that ever so slightly, you can. But the tolerance is pretty good. You can ease things in when you're actually sewing this all together. Like when you're putting this part onto the bottom, you can ease that in. It shouldn't be a problem as long as you're not too far out. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to get my foam. So I'm using by Annie's foam. I really like it. It works really well for me. My domestic machines don't have a hard time with it, so that's what I like to use. You can use fusible fleece. Depends on, for me anyway, in my experience with my bag making, it really depends on the materials choices that I use for the rest of it. If I was going to use a really lightweight vinyl, if I can fuse anything to it, and I can also spray glue, because that's what I'm going to be doing with this as well. But if I was using a kind of a lightweight vinyl and I wanted just a little bit more body to it, but I didn't want it too stiff, then I would use a fusible fleece. There's lots of people out there that just absolutely love Decoville product. So there's Decoville, which is the heavier, and then there's Decoville Light. So if you want to use Decoville Light for this, you probably won't have a problem with sewing with your domestic machines. Again, I hesitate to suggest Decoville or Decoville Light in this case, just because I'm not all that familiar with the product. I don't know my machines. I don't use it. Hopefully you're experienced enough. If you're using those products, you know what your machine can handle depending on the materials that you're using. So I will leave that up to you. But I'm going to be using foam, and this is not a fusible foam. So this is like a sew-in, but I do actually want to fuse it. I like the look of my fabric being fused to the product. So I'm going to use this. This is an OTIF product. Quilters will be more familiar maybe with the 505, which is a spray based. So it's a temporary. This is actually a permanent adhesive. So this is what I like to use. I think this product is great. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to just completely spray, of course, the wrong side, either my foam or on my fabric, and I'm going to fuse this down. I'm going to wait and I'm going to trim this off later on. So I'm going to fuse first and then I'll worry about straightening that edge. So now I have my fabric. It is fused to my foam. It's all one piece, and I've just trimmed the two edges so that they're straight. Sorry, I've trimmed the foam off so that the foam is even. This is not squared. So the next thing that we need to do is, this is my little oops. I'm going to show you my Band-Aid. I cut my foam a little bit too short, like about an inch or so too short. So all I did was I used a little bit of interfacing, cut another piece, butted it up to it, and just fused a piece of fusible interfacing like a Band-Aid, and then it's just works. So now these, if I laid this straight, it's not going to be straight up here. That's not a problem. I'm just going to kind of wiggle this over. So I'm going to line this last one up, and I'm going to use again a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to show you how I trim that foam out of that seam allowance before I top stitch. Okay, so now I have this seam is done, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to pull back, and I've got it stuck on there pretty darn good. I'm just going to pull my foam back from my fabric. Okay. I want to make sure that I don't cut my fabric, but I want to keep my foam as close to my stitching as I can. So now I've got my foam is trimmed off of both sides. So I'm going to find out which way I need to go. So I can see this seam is, my seam allowance is pressed this way. So I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to press this over and top stitch through the foam and everything. Okay, so here, this is what we have, is basically we've just got a continuous tube, and that completes this step of the pattern. And the great thing about this is, if there's anything that you really like and want to feature on the front, you can just choose. There's no real, like, there's no side seams or anything. It's just a continuous thing, so you just choose what you want.